A millionaire forced his son to marry a humble cleaner. However, he was stunned by what his son did. Arthur Sullivan sat in his sprawling office on the top floor of Sullivan Enterprises, staring at the framed photo of his late grandfather. The elder Sullivan's eyes, sharp and filled with purpose, seemed to pierce through the glass, a silent reminder of the family values that had once been the foundation of their success. But those days felt like a distant memory now. The company, once a titan in the business world, was hanging by a thread. Competitors were circling like vultures, and the empire Arthur had dedicated his life to preserving was crumbling beneath his feet. He sighed heavily, adjusting his cufflinks as his lawyer. Mr. Andrews walked in. "You're not going to like this," Andrews began, holding a stack of yellowed documents tied together with a red ribbon. Arthur leaned back in his chair, gesturing impatiently. "Just tell me. It can't be worse than what I already know." Andrews hesitated before placing the papers on Arthur's desk. "Your grandfather's will contains a clause that complicates things." Arthur furrowed his brow, his eyes scanning the papers. "What clause?" "It states that to access the inheritance, specifically the family trust, your son, Zachary, must marry a woman of humble origins. The intent was to ensure the Sullivan family never loses touch with the values of hard work and humility." Arthur froze, his mind racing. Zachary, married to someone humble, his son, who couldn't stand a day without luxury, who dismissed anyone outside his social circle as beneath him. It was a ludicrous thought. Yet, as Arthur continued to read, the reality sank in. Without this inheritance, there was no saving Sullivan Enterprises. "This is absurd," Arthur muttered, slamming the papers down. "I agree it's unconventional," Andrews said carefully, "but it's binding, and given the company's financial state, this might be your only option." Arthur stood, pacing the room. "Zachary will never agree to this. He's too—" He paused, searching for the right word. "Entitled. Then you'll have to convince him," Andrews replied, "or the company falls apart." Across town, Zachary Sullivan reclined on a leather couch in his penthouse apartment, scrolling through social media on his phone. The headlines about Sullivan Enterprises' struggles didn't faze him. He trusted his father to handle it. After all, Arthur Sullivan always had a plan. When Arthur arrived unannounced, Zachary barely looked up. "You're early for one of your lectures, Dad." Arthur didn't bother with pleasantries. "We need to talk now." The tone in his father's voice made Zachary sit up. "What's going on?" Arthur handed him the will. As Zachary read, his expression shifted from confusion to disbelief to outrage. "You can't be serious. You want me to marry, what, some maid, just to save the company?" "It's not just about the company," Arthur said, though even he wasn't sure if he believed it. "It's about preserving what our family stands for." Zachary laughed bitterly. "Since when do you care about family values? All you've ever cared about is power and money." Arthur's jaw tightened. "This isn't up for debate. If you don't do this, everything we've built will be gone. Do you understand that?" Zachary stared at his father, his mind racing. He'd spent his entire life living in luxury, enjoying the privileges that came with the Sullivan name. Was he really willing to lose it all? Arthur saw the hesitation in his son's eyes and pressed on. "There's a woman who works at the mansion, Samantha Parker. She's hardworking, humble, exactly what your grandfather envisioned, and she's available." "Available," Zachary repeated, incredulous. "You've already picked someone out. She's the perfect candidate," Arthur said firmly. "I'll handle the arrangements. You just need to cooperate." Zachary leaned back, his arms crossed. "And what does she get out of this?" "A lifetime of dealing with me." Arthur hesitated. "Her family needs financial help. This arrangement would benefit everyone." Zachary stared at his father, then at the will in his hands. "This is insane." "Think about it," Arthur said, his tone final. "Because if you don't, we lose everything." Later that evening, Samantha Parker stood in the grand Sullivan mansion, scrubbing the marble floor of the main hall. Her hands were calloused, her back ached, but she worked with quiet determination. Her thoughts drifted to her mother, who was battling illness back home. The paycheck from this job barely covered the medical bills. But Samantha refused to give up when Arthur approached her with the proposition. She thought it was a cruel joke. You want me to marry your son? Why? Arthur's expression softened, just enough to seem convincing. You're a good person, Samantha. This arrangement could help your family, and it's not forever. Samantha looked at him, her mind racing. It wasn't just her life at stake. It was her mother's. I'll think about it, she said quietly, knowing deep down that she had no choice. The morning sun filtered through the thin curtains of Samantha Parker's modest apartment. The scent of coffee brewing filled the tiny kitchen, a comfort amidst the weight of her responsibilities. Samantha sat at the small dining table, her hands wrapped around a chipped ceramic mug as she scanned the list of bills stacked neatly before her. Rent was overdue. The hospital had sent yet another reminder about her mother's treatment costs. Her savings, meager as they were, wouldn't last another month. Her mother, Ellen, emerged from the bedroom, her frail frame draped in a worn robe. "Morning, sweetheart," Ellen said, her voice warm, despite the weariness that lingered in her tone. "Morning, Mom," Samantha replied, forcing a smile. "How are you feeling?" Ellen shrugged. "Better, I think that tea you brought home really helped." Samantha nodded. Though she knew Ellen was just trying to ease her worries, the truth was, the medical bills loomed over them like a dark cloud, and Samantha was running out of options. "I'll head to work soon," Samantha said, standing and rinsing her mug in the sink. "Mrs. Collins said she might need extra cleaning done in the East Wing today. It could mean a little overtime." Ellen's brow furrowed. "You're already working yourself to the bone, Sam. Don't push too hard." "I'm fine, Mom," Samantha insisted gently. "We'll get through this. I promise." The Sullivan mansion was a world apart from Samantha's humble apartment. Its towering columns and sprawling grounds radiated wealth and power. But to Samantha, it always felt cold and impersonal. She had been working there for nearly a year, scrubbing floors, dusting priceless artifacts, and ensuring every surface sparkled under the relentless gaze of Mrs. Collins, the head housekeeper. "Parker," Mrs. Collins called out sharply as Samantha entered the service entrance. "You're assigned to the West Library today, mister. Sullivan will be in meetings, so make sure you stay out of sight." "Yes, ma'am," Samantha replied, grabbing her cleaning supplies and heading toward the Grand Library. The West Library was a cavernous room filled with floor-to-ceiling shelves of leather-bound books. A large desk sat at its center, cluttered with papers and an ornate globe that gleamed under the sunlight streaming through the tall windows. Samantha worked methodically, wiping down the mahogany surfaces and carefully dusting each shelf. As she worked, her thoughts wandered. The opulence of the mansion never ceased to amaze her. But it also served as a stark reminder of how different her life was from those who lived here. She couldn't help but wonder what it would be like to have even a fraction of their comfort, their security. Her daydream was interrupted when she heard footsteps approaching. Startled, she quickly moved to the far corner of the room, hoping to remain unnoticed. But as the door swung open, her heart sank. It was Zachary Sullivan. He walked in with the air of someone who owned not just the room, but the world itself. His tailored suit and effortless confidence were a stark contrast to Samantha's plain uniform and weary demeanor. He didn't notice her at first. His attention focused on his phone as he muttered something under his breath. Samantha tried to stay invisible, but as she shifted to reach a high shelf, a book slipped from her grip and thudded onto the floor. Zachary's head snapped up, his sharp eyes locking onto hers. "Who are you?" he demanded, his tone brusque. "Samantha Parker," she said, her voice steady despite her racing heart. "I'm part of the cleaning staff." Zachary raised an eyebrow, clearly unimpressed. "Well, Parker, try to be quieter. Some of us are trying to think." Samantha bit her tongue, choosing not to respond. She picked up the book and placed it back on the shelf, resuming her work as if he weren't there. But Zachary didn't leave. Instead, he sank into the chair by the desk, scrolling through his phone and occasionally glancing at her. It was as though he was daring her to break the unspoken rule. Staff should be neither seen nor heard. Finally, he spoke again. "Do you like working here?" Samantha paused, surprised by the question. "It's a job," she said carefully. "Right," Zachary said, smirking. "I suppose for someone like you, that's enough." Her grip tightened on the dusting cloth, but she kept her expression neutral. "Excuse me," she said, moving past him to reach another shelf. "Relax, Parker," he said, leaning back in his chair. "I'm just making conversation." Samantha didn't respond. She focused on her work, determined not to give him the satisfaction of a reaction. But as she left the library, she couldn't shake the feeling that Zachary Sullivan wasn't just arrogant. He was completely disconnected from the reality of people like her. That evening, as she returned home, Samantha found her mother dozing on the couch. She set the table for dinner, her thoughts heavy with the day's events. Arthur's sudden interest in her during the past few weeks had been strange, and now Zachary's presence added a new layer of discomfort. She shook her head. Pushing the thoughts aside, her priority was her mother and keeping their heads above water. Whatever was happening at the Sullivan mansion, she would deal with it one day at a time. The Sullivan mansion was buzzing with activity the next morning. Caterers and decorators rushed through the grand hall, preparing for an exclusive business dinner that Arthur Sullivan had organized to impress potential investors. Samantha moved quietly through the chaos, avoiding eye contact as she focused on her assigned tasks. She was dusting the staircase banister when Mrs. Collins approached with her usual sharp tone. "Parker, the guest bathrooms on the second floor need to be cleaned immediately. Move quickly. We don't have time for mistakes today." "Yes, ma'am," Samantha replied, grabbing her cleaning supplies and heading upstairs. As she worked in one of the bathrooms, she overheard voices outside in the hallway. "This is absurd," Zachary's familiar voice echoed, laced with frustration. "You will do as I say," Arthur's voice replied, cold and commanding. Samantha froze, her hand mid-scrub on the sink. She wasn't one to eavesdrop, but their voices carried, and curiosity got the better of her. "Marry a stranger? A maid? Have you lost your mind?" Zachary's words were filled with disdain. "This is not a negotiation, Zachary," Arthur said firmly. "Samantha Parker is the perfect choice for this arrangement. She's hardworking, humble, and fits the criteria perfectly. You don't have to love her. You just have to marry her." Samantha's heart dropped. Did she just hear her name? "No," Zachary snapped. "This is insane. You can't seriously expect me to go through with this." "I'm not expecting, I'm demanding," Arthur replied. "You'll either agree or you can kiss your inheritance goodbye." There was a pause, and Samantha could feel the tension even from behind the door. "You're unbelievable," Zachary said finally, his voice dripping with resentment. His footsteps echoed down the hallway as he stormed off. Samantha stood frozen, her mind racing. Marriage, her, to Zachary. The idea was so absurd she almost laughed, but the cold seriousness in Arthur's voice told her it was no joke. Later that day, Samantha was summoned to Arthur's office. Her stomach churned as she walked down the grand corridor, her footsteps muffled by the plush carpet. When she entered, Arthur was seated at his massive desk, his piercing gaze fixed on her. "Please, sit," he said, gesturing to the chair opposite him. Samantha sat, clutching her hands tightly in her lap. "You wanted to see me, Mr. Sullivan." Arthur leaned forward, his hands folded on the desk. "Samantha, I'm going to be direct. I've chosen you for a unique opportunity that could benefit both of us." Her heart pounded. "An opportunity?" Arthur nodded. "My son, Zachary, needs to marry someone of humble origins to fulfill a requirement in my father's will. I believe you're the perfect candidate for this arrangement." Samantha blinked, stunned. "You're asking me to marry your son?" "Yes," Arthur said without hesitation. "This arrangement would secure the future of my family's business and provide financial support for you and your family. I'm aware of your mother's medical expenses. This could change everything for you." Samantha stared at him, her mind reeling. "But I don't love your son. He doesn't even like me." "This isn't about love," Arthur said coolly. "It's a business arrangement. You'll be compensated generously, and the marriage doesn't have to be permanent." Samantha felt a mix of anger and disbelief. "You're treating this like some kind of transaction." Arthur's expression hardened. "It is a transaction, Samantha. One that could save my family and yours. Think about it carefully. This offer might not come again." That evening, Samantha sat at the small dining table in her apartment, staring at the envelope Arthur had handed her. It contained a proposal with clear terms, a guaranteed financial sum for her family, full medical coverage for her mother, and additional funds upon completing the arrangement. Her mother, Ellen, noticed her silence. "Sam, what's wrong?" Samantha hesitated, then handed Ellen the letter as her mother read it. Her eyes widened. This is a lot of money. I know, Samantha said quietly. But it's a marriage, Sam. Are you sure about this? I don't know, Samantha admitted. But if I say no, we'll lose the apartment and your treatments. I don't see another way. Ellen reached across the table and took Samantha's hand. You've always been so strong. Whatever you decide, I'll support you. Samantha nodded, tears brimming in her eyes. Thanks, Mom. The next morning, Samantha returned to the Sullivan mansion with her decision. She knocked on Arthur's office door, her heart pounding as she stepped inside. Arthur looked up from his paperwork, raising an eyebrow. Well, Samantha took a deep breath. I'll do it. I'll marry your son. Arthur's lips curled into a small, satisfied smile. Excellent. I'll take care of the arrangements. You've made the right choice, Samantha. But as she left the office, a sinking feeling settled in her chest. The path ahead was filled with uncertainty, and she couldn't shake the sense that this decision would change her life in ways she couldn't yet imagine. The Sullivan mansion was unusually quiet the following morning, as though the walls themselves held their breath for what was to come. Samantha arrived early, unsure of how her day would unfold after the decision she had made. Every step through the grand hall felt heavier than usual, her mind swirling with questions. Mrs. Collins caught her attention near the kitchen. Parker, she said brusquely, Mr. Sullivan has requested you in the drawing room. Now? Samantha nodded, wiping her hands on her apron and making her way to the ornate room. When she entered, Arthur and Zachary were seated across from each other, their expressions a mixture of tension and disdain. Ah, Samantha, Arthur said, standing as she approached. Take a seat. She hesitated before perching on the edge of the nearest chair, her hands folded nervously in her lap. Zachary didn't bother hiding his irritation. He leaned back, crossing his arms. So, she agreed, he said, his tone dripping with sarcasm. Arthur shot him a warning look, before turning to Samantha. Samantha has made a mature and selfless decision. She understands the importance of this arrangement for everyone involved. Samantha met Zachary's gaze briefly, only to find his eyes cold and filled with disdain. Let me guess, Zachary said, his smirk cutting through the silence. You're doing this for the money, right? Samantha's face flushed, but she didn't falter. I'm doing this for my family, she said firmly. For my mother. You may not understand that. But it's the truth. Zachary chuckled bitterly. Oh, I understand perfectly. Another person willing to sell themselves for a price. That's enough, Arthur snapped, his voice sharp. This isn't a debate, Zachary. The arrangements have been made, and the wedding will take place this weekend. Samantha's breath caught. This weekend? She repeated, her voice barely above a whisper. Yes, Arthur said without hesitation. The sooner, the better. Zachary shook his head in disbelief. You're unbelievable, Dad. Forcing me into this ridiculous charade and expecting me to just play along. Arthur's expression darkened. You will play along because you have no other choice. If you refuse, everything you've ever known, your lifestyle, your inheritance, your legacy, will disappear. Zachary stood abruptly, his chair scraping against the floor. Fine, he said through gritted teeth, but don't expect me to pretend to like it. With that, he stormed out of the room, leaving Samantha and Arthur in an uncomfortable silence. The days leading up to the wedding were a blur for Samantha. She was fitted for a simple white dress, her hair styled by a professional for the first time in her life. Every step felt surreal, like she was living someone else's life. On the morning of the wedding, Samantha stood in a small dressing room within the Sullivan estate, staring at her reflection. The gown was beautiful, but it felt like a costume, a facade for a role she never wanted to play. Her mother entered the room, her face lighting up when she saw Samantha. You look stunning, Ellen said, tears welling in her eyes. Samantha turned to her, her own emotions threatening to overflow. Mom, what if this is a mistake? Ellen took her hands gently. Mistake or not, you're doing this for the right reasons. That's all that matters. The ceremony was held in the Sullivan Mansion's grand ballroom. Transformed into an elegant venue with cascading flowers and glittering chandeliers, only a handful of close associates and family members attended, keeping the event small and controlled. Samantha stood at the end of the aisle, her heart pounding as the string quartet began to play. Arthur stood next to Zachary at the altar, his face a mask of control. Zachary, on the other hand, looked every bit the reluctant groom, his jaw set tightly and his hands clenched at his sides. As Samantha walked toward him, she focused on her breathing, determined not to let the weight of the moment overwhelm her. When she reached the altar, Zachary barely glanced at her, his expression unreadable. The officiant began the ceremony, his voice echoing in the vast room. The words felt distant to Samantha, as though she were watching a play instead of living it. When it came time for their vows, Zachary's voice was cold and detached. "I take you, Samantha Parker, to be my wife, for better or worse." Samantha's hands trembled as she repeated her own vows, her voice steady despite the storm inside her. When the officiant pronounced them husband and wife, Zachary hesitated for a moment before leaning in to place a perfunctory kiss on her cheek. The gesture was mechanical, devoid of warmth, and Samantha felt the sting of humiliation. The reception was just as awkward. Zachary spent most of the evening avoiding Samantha, mingling with guests or scrolling through his phone. Samantha sat at the head table, quietly observing the lavish display around her. Arthur approached her at one point, his demeanor softer than usual. "You did well today," he said. "This is the beginning of something important." Samantha nodded, though she wasn't sure she believed him. As the evening wore on, Zachary finally approached her, a drink in his hand. "Enjoying yourself?" he asked, his tone dripping with sarcasm. "Not particularly," Samantha replied honestly. He smirked. "Well, get used to it. This is our life now, isn't it?" Samantha met his gaze, her voice firm. "It doesn't have to be miserable, Zachary. That's up to you." His smirk faltered for a moment before he turned and walked away, leaving Samantha alone once again. The first morning as Mrs. Zachary Sullivan was nothing like Samantha had imagined. The wedding had left her emotionally drained, and the reality of her new life was sinking in. She woke up in the guest suite of the Sullivan mansion, her belongings neatly arranged in a corner, as if to remind her that she was a visitor in a world that wasn't hers. As she dressed for the day, a knock on the door startled her. When she opened it, Zachary stood there, leaning casually against the doorframe with a cup of coffee in hand. "Well, good morning, Mrs. Sullivan," he said, his voice dripping with mockery. Samantha crossed her arms, not in the mood for his games. "What do you want, Zachary?" He smirked. "Just checking to see if you survived your first night as a Sullivan. Figured I'd offer some advice. Don't get too comfortable." Her jaw tightened, but she forced herself to stay calm. "Thanks for the tip. I'll keep that in mind." He shrugged, clearly enjoying her discomfort, and sauntered off down the hallway. Samantha spent the rest of the morning trying to navigate the unfamiliar routines of her new life. The mansion's staff, who had once been her peers, now treated her with a mix of curiosity and awkward politeness. It was as if they didn't know whether to see her as one of them or as their new employer. Mrs. Collins, ever efficient, approached her with a clipboard. "Mrs. Sullivan, I've prepared a schedule for you. It includes luncheons, charity events, and a few business functions Mr. Sullivan believes you should attend with him." Samantha frowned. "Business functions? Why would I—" "It's expected," Mrs. Collins interrupted smoothly. "As his wife, you'll be representing the Sullivan family. Appearances are everything." Samantha nodded reluctantly. She had agreed to this arrangement knowing it would be challenging, but she hadn't anticipated just how overwhelming it would be. Meanwhile, Zachary spent most of the day avoiding Samantha. He threw himself into work, retreating to his office or meeting with colleagues to discuss projects that, in truth, barely interested him. When Arthur stopped by his office that afternoon, Zachary didn't bother hiding his frustration. "You've made your point, Dad," he said curtly. "I've married her. Can we drop the act now?" Arthur's expression didn't waver. "This isn't an act, Zachary. You're part of something bigger than yourself, whether you like it or not." Zachary scoffed. "Spare me the lecture, you don't care about her or me. This is about control. It always has been." Arthur leaned forward, his voice lowering. "You'd do well to remember that without me, you'd have nothing. So, you can either sulk like a child, or start acting like the man I know you can be." Zachary clenched his fists but said nothing. Arthur left without another word, leaving his son alone with his thoughts. That evening, Samantha and Zachary were required to attend a formal dinner with a few of Arthur's business associates. Samantha dressed in a sleek navy gown loaned to her by a stylist hired by Arthur. When she entered the dining room, Zachary glanced up from his phone, his gaze flickering briefly over her before returning to the screen. "You clean up nicely," he muttered, not bothering to sound sincere. Samantha ignored the comment and took her seat beside him. The dinner was a tense affair, filled with polite conversation and veiled comments about the state of the Sullivan Empire. Samantha felt out of place, but she managed to smile and nod at the right moments, determined not to embarrass herself. At one point, one of the guests, a sharp-eyed woman named Victoria, leaned in and asked, "So, Samantha, how did you and Zachary meet?" Samantha froze, unprepared for the question. Before she could respond, Zachary smirked and said, "Oh, it's a charming story. She was cleaning a staircase when we crossed paths. Love at first sight." Laughter rippled around the table, but Samantha felt the sting of humiliation. She glanced at Zachary, who raised his glass in a mock toast. "Excuse me," Samantha said, rising abruptly from the table. She retreated to the balcony, the cool night air soothing her flushed cheeks. She gripped the railing, her mind racing. Why had she agreed to this? Was the financial security for her family worth the constant belittlement? Zachary found her a few minutes later, leaning casually against the doorway. "You're not holding up too well, are you?" She turned to face him, her eyes blazing. "Do you enjoy making a fool of me?" He shrugged. "It's not personal. I didn't ask for this arrangement any more than you did. Then maybe we should stop making it harder than it already is," she shot back. For a moment he said nothing, his expression unreadable. Then he straightened and stepped closer. "You want to survive this, Samantha? Here's a tip. Don't expect anyone in this house to care about you, least of all me." His words cut deeper than she expected, but she refused to let him see it. "Noted," she said, her voice steady. He walked away, leaving her alone on the balcony. As she stared out into the darkness, Samantha felt a flicker of resolve. She might not have chosen this life, but she wouldn't let Zachary or anyone else break her spirit. The sun filtered through the towering windows of the Sullivan Mansion's west wing, bathing the marble floors in a golden hue. Samantha stood in the dining room, setting the table for a luncheon. Arthur had organized with a few prominent business associates. Her movements were precise, her focus unwavering. Across the room, Zachary leaned against the doorway, watching her with a mix of curiosity and annoyance. He had noticed over the past weeks how effortlessly she had adapted to this world, even if she didn't belong to it. She was graceful, but stubborn, a contradiction that unnerved him. "You've gotten good at playing the role," Zachary said, breaking the silence. Samantha looked up, surprised to see him there. "I didn't realize I was being watched," he smirked. "Hard not to notice when someone's trying so hard." She straightened, meeting his gaze. "I'm doing what I agreed to do. If you have a problem with that, take it up with your father." His smirk faltered, replaced by a flash of something she couldn't quite place. Guilt, maybe. But before she could think too much about it, he shrugged and walked away. The luncheon was an affair of stiff smiles and polite conversation, the kind Samantha had come to expect. She sat beside Zachary, who was uncharacteristically quiet, occasionally nodding or offering clipped responses to the guests. Midway through the meal, one of the associates, a man named Mr. Green, turned to Samantha with a curious expression. "So, Mrs. Sullivan, tell us, what are your thoughts on the current state of the hospitality industry?" Samantha froze, unprepared for the question. She could feel the weight of everyone's eyes on her, including Zachary's. She began, scrambling for words. Zachary leaned in, his voice calm but firm. "Samantha believes that personalized service is the key to standing out in a crowded market." The guest nodded in approval, and Mr. Green smiled. "An excellent point, Mrs. Sullivan." Samantha glanced at Zachary. Surprised by his intervention, he caught her eye briefly before turning back to the conversation, as if it hadn't happened. Later that evening, Samantha found herself in the garden, seeking solace among the neatly trimmed hedges and fragrant roses. She sat on a stone bench, the cool breeze brushing against her face as she replayed the day's events in her mind. "Long day." Zachary's voice broke through the quiet. She turned to see him standing a few feet away, his hands in his pockets. "You could say that," she replied, her tone neutral. He approached and sat on the other end of the bench, leaving a comfortable distance between them. For a moment, neither of them spoke, the silence filled only by the chirping of crickets. "Why did you do that?" she asked finally. Do what? Help me during the luncheon. He shrugged. You looked like you needed it. Samantha studied him, searching for a trace of sarcasm, but his expression was unusually sincere. Thank you, she said softly. He nodded, his gaze fixed on the roses. Don't read too much into it. It doesn't change anything. I wasn't planning to, she replied, a hint of a smile tugging at her lips. In the days that followed, Samantha noticed small changes in Zachary's behavior. He still kept his distance, but the sharp edges of his personality seemed to soften. He asked her questions about her day, listened when she spoke, and even shared snippets of his own life, though he rarely let his guard down completely. One afternoon, as they sat in the library, Samantha ventured a question that had been on her mind for weeks. Why do you hate this so much? Zachary looked up from the book he was pretending to read, his brow furrowing. Hate what? This arrangement, me. He sighed, setting the book aside. It's not about you, Samantha. It's about what this represents. My father's control, his ability to dictate every part of my life. She nodded slowly. I get that, but you don't have to take it out on me. He hesitated, the weight of her words sinking in. You're right, he admitted quietly. I've been unfair to you. The admission caught her off guard. She opened her mouth to respond, but was interrupted by a knock at the door. Arthur entered, his usual air of authority filling the room. Good, Arthur said, glancing between them. I need both of you at the charity gala tomorrow night. It's important for appearances. Zachary groaned. Another gala, can't you send someone else? No, Arthur said firmly. You're the face of this family, Zachary. Start acting like it. With that, he left, leaving an awkward silence in his wake. The next evening, the charity gala was a dazzling affair, with glittering chandeliers, flowing champagne, and a sea of designer gowns. Samantha wore a stunning burgundy dress, her hair swept into an elegant updo. She felt out of place but determined to hold her own. Zachary, dressed in a tailored tuxedo, offered her his arm as they entered the ballroom. Shall we? He said, his tone almost teasing. Samantha hesitated before taking his arm. Let's get this over with. Throughout the night, they played their roles perfectly, smiling for the cameras and mingling with guests. To anyone watching, they looked like the perfect couple. But as the evening wore on, Samantha began to see glimpses of the man beneath Zachary's facade. When he spoke to a young woman raising funds for a children's hospital, his genuine interest and warmth surprised her. For the first time, she wondered if there was more to him than she had given him credit for. By the end of the night, as they drove back to the mansion in silence, Samantha stole a glance at Zachary. He was staring out the window, his expression unreadable. Good night, Zachary, she said softly when they arrived. He turned to her, his eyes meeting hers for a brief moment. Good night. Samantha, as she climbed the stairs to her room, Samantha couldn't shake the feeling that the cracks in Zachary's armor were beginning to show. The Sullivan mansion was unusually quiet the next morning, the stillness unsettling. Samantha moved through the grand halls with a sense of purpose, though her mind remained on the subtle changes she had noticed in Zachary. He was still guarded, but something about him seemed different, less abrasive, more reflective. As she passed Arthur's office, she overheard raised voices. Pausing for a moment, she recognized Zachary's tone, sharp with frustration. This is getting ridiculous, Dad. You're pulling strings, controlling everything. And for what? To keep this facade alive? Arthur's voice followed, calm but firm. This isn't just about the company, Zachary. It's about ensuring the Sullivan name means something. If you can't understand that, then maybe you're not ready to lead. Lead, Zachary scoffed. You're not grooming me to lead. You're turning me into a puppet. Samantha's chest tightened as the argument continued. She wasn't sure why, but hearing Zachary stand up to his father stirred something within her. Later that day, Samantha found herself alone in the library, her usual refuge when the weight of the mansion became too much. She had just settled into a chair with a book when the door creaked open. Arthur stepped in, his presence commanding as always. He gave her a measured look before sitting across from her. Mrs. Sullivan, he began, his tone formal. I wanted to thank you for how you've handled yourself so far. You've adjusted well to your new role. Samantha closed her book, her gaze steady. I'm doing what was asked of me. Arthur nodded, but there was something in his eyes, an undercurrent of calculation. And you've done it admirably. But I need to remind you of the stakes. This arrangement isn't just about appearances. It's about survival, for all of us. I understand that, Samantha replied carefully, but I can't help but feel like there's more to this than you've told me. Arthur's expression didn't waver. You're perceptive, Samantha. That will serve you well, but some truths are better left unspoken. Before she could press further, he stood and left the room, leaving her with more questions than answers. As the weeks passed, Samantha's unease grew. There were moments when Arthur's control over Zachary became painfully evident, and she couldn't shake the feeling that the patriarch was hiding something significant. One evening, while organizing the shelves in the library, Samantha stumbled across a stack of old files tucked behind a row of books. Curious, she pulled them out and flipped through the pages. They contained financial records, meeting minutes, and personal notes, all related to the Sullivan family business. What caught her attention was a series of handwritten letters from Arthur's late father, the man whose will had set this entire chain of events into motion. The letters spoke of a vision for the family, one rooted in integrity, humility, and a connection to the people they served. But as Samantha read further, she noticed a troubling pattern. The recent entries in the financial records told a different story. Risky investments, strained partnerships, and evidence that Arthur had been manipulating key players to keep the company afloat. Her hands trembled as she pieced together the truth. Arthur wasn't just trying to preserve the Sullivan name. He was trying to cover up his own mistakes. Samantha debated what to do with her discovery. Unsure of whom she could trust, her instinct was to tell Zachary, but their relationship was still too fragile. Would he even believe her? The opportunity came sooner than she expected. Late one evening, she found Zachary in the kitchen, pouring himself a drink. He looked up as she entered, his expression neutral. "Couldn't sleep?" he asked, gesturing to the teapot on the counter. "Something like that," she replied, busying herself with the tea. There was a long silence before she spoke again. "Zachary, can I ask you something?" He raised an eyebrow. "Depends on the question." She hesitated, then plunged ahead. "Do you trust your father?" The question caught him off guard. He set down his glass, his brow furrowing. "Why do you ask?" "I found some documents in the library," she admitted, her voice cautious. "They suggest that he's been less than honest about the company's situation." Zachary's jaw tightened. "What kind of documents?" "Financial records, letters from your grandfather," she said. "It looks like your father's been taking risks, big ones, to keep the business afloat." For a moment, Zachary said nothing, his expression unreadable. Then he sighed, running a hand through his hair. "I've suspected for a while that he wasn't telling me everything. But if what you're saying is true, it's all in the library," Samantha said quietly. "You can see for yourself." The next morning, Zachary confronted Arthur in his office. Samantha stayed out of sight but could hear their heated exchange echoing through the mansion. "You've been lying to me," Zachary accused. "This whole marriage, this arrangement, it's not about legacy. It's about cleaning up your mess." Arthur didn't deny it. Instead, he said calmly, "I've done what's necessary to protect this family. You'd do well to remember that." "Protect," Zachary scoffed. "You've been tearing it apart." The argument ended with Arthur dismissing Zachary, his voice cold and final. But as Zachary stormed out of the office, he caught sight of Samantha at the end of the hall. "Come with me," he said, his tone firm but not unkind. She followed him to the garden, where he paced back and forth before finally turning to her. "Why did you tell me?" "Because you deserve to know," she replied simply. He studied her for a long moment before nodding. "Thank you," he said, his voice softer than she'd ever heard it. For the first time, Samantha felt like they were on the same side. The revelation about Arthur's manipulation hung heavy over the Sullivan mansion. Zachary spent hours poring over the documents Samantha had found, his mind racing with questions. Every page confirmed what he had suspected, but never dared to confront. His father's control over the family and the business ran deeper than he had imagined. Samantha found him in the library later that evening, surrounded by papers and notes. He looked up as she entered. Exhaustion etched into his features. "You were right," he said simply. She approached cautiously, unsure of what to say. "What are you going to do about it?" He leaned back in his chair, rubbing his temples. "I don't know yet. Confronting him doesn't seem to make a difference. He always finds a way to justify everything. Maybe you don't need to confront him," Samantha suggested. "Maybe you just need to show him that you're not his puppet." Zachary looked at her, a flicker of determination in his eyes. "You're saying I need to take control?" She nodded. "It's your family, your name. You have more power than you think." Over the next few days, Zachary began to change. He started attending business meetings with a sharper focus, asking questions and challenging decisions that had once gone unopposed. Arthur noticed the shift and wasn't pleased. "You're overstepping," Arthur said during a particularly heated discussion in the boardroom. "No," Zachary replied firmly. "I'm doing what you should have done, protecting the integrity of this company." Arthur's gaze darkened, but he didn't respond. The tension between father and son grew with each passing day, spilling into their interactions at home. Samantha observed the transformation quietly, a mix of pride and concern growing within her. While Zachary's newfound resolve was admirable, it also put him directly at odds with Arthur, a man who didn't take challenges lightly. One evening, as Samantha prepared for bed, there was a knock at her door. She opened it to find Zachary standing there, his expression conflicted. "Can we talk?" he asked. She stepped aside, allowing him in. "I owe you an apology," he began, his tone earnest. "For what?" she asked, genuinely surprised. "For how I've treated you since this all started," he admitted. "I've been a jerk, and you didn't deserve that. You've been better to me than I've been to you, and I just wanted to say I'm sorry." Samantha studied him, her defenses softening. "Thank you," she said quietly. "That means a lot." They sat in silence for a moment before Zachary spoke again. "You didn't have to tell me about the documents. You could have kept quiet, let me stay in the dark, but you didn't. I thought you deserved to know the truth," she replied simply. He nodded, a faint smile tugging at his lips. "You're a lot braver than I gave you credit for," Samantha chuckled softly. "And you're a lot more capable than you give yourself credit for." Their eyes met, and for the first time, there was a genuine connection between them. As Zachary's confidence grew, so did his willingness to include Samantha in his life. He began seeking her input on small matters, valuing her perspective in ways that surprised both of them. One afternoon, as they walked through the garden, he turned to her with a curious expression. "What did you want to be when you were younger?" Samantha laughed, caught off guard by the question. "Honestly, I wanted to be a teacher, but life had other plans." "You'd make a good teacher," Zachary said thoughtfully. She smiled. "Thanks. What about you? Did you always want to be part of the family business?" He shook his head. "Not really. I always felt like I had no choice. My dad made sure of that." "Well, maybe it's time you make your own choices," Samantha said gently. Her words stayed with him, planting seeds of determination. The turning point came during a high-profile charity gala hosted by the Sullivans. Arthur, as usual, orchestrated every detail, ensuring the event would showcase the family's wealth and influence. As Samantha and Zachary mingled with the guests, she noticed how effortlessly he commanded the room. He spoke with confidence, engaging in meaningful conversations that left an impression on everyone he met. When the time came for a speech, Arthur took the stage first, delivering his usual rhetoric about legacy and success. But as he finished, Zachary stepped forward, surprising everyone. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, his voice steady, "I'd like to add something to what my father said. Legacy isn't just about wealth or power. It's about integrity, about standing for something greater than yourself. That's what I want to build. Something real. Something lasting." The room erupted into applause, and Samantha felt a swell of pride. Arthur's expression was unreadable, but Samantha knew he wasn't pleased. After the gala, Zachary and Samantha shared a quiet moment on the mansion's balcony. The city lights twinkled in the distance, and the cool breeze carried the scent of blooming flowers. "You were amazing tonight," Samantha said, breaking the silence. "Thanks," Zachary replied, his gaze distant. "But I'm not done yet. There's still so much to fix." "And you will," she said confidently. "I believe in you." He turned to her, his eyes softening. "You know, I never thought I'd say this, But I'm glad you're here, Samantha. You've been good for me. She smiled, her heart warming at his words. You're not so bad yourself, Zachary. For the first time since their arrangement began, they felt like partners, not just in name, but in purpose. The morning sun filtered through the massive windows of the Sullivan mansion, casting long, golden beams across the dining room. Zachary and Samantha sat across from each other at the grand table, the clinking of utensils on fine china, the only sound between them. It was a quiet but comfortable silence, a far cry from the tension that had defined their early days together. Zachary glanced up, watching as Samantha meticulously spread jam on her toast. You're quiet today, he said casually, breaking the silence. She looked up, a hint of surprise in her expression. Just thinking about everything, I guess, she replied, setting her knife down. This house, this situation, it's not exactly what I imagined my life would be like, he smirked. Join the club. Samantha couldn't help but laugh softly. Fair enough. Later that day, Zachary found himself seeking out Samantha more than usual. He wasn't sure why, but something about her calm presence grounded him in a way he hadn't expected. He found her in the garden, kneeling beside a bed of roses with a small pair of pruning shears in hand. You're full of surprises, he said, approaching her. Samantha glanced up, squinting against the sunlight. How so? I didn't peg you for a gardener, he said, gesturing to the neatly trimmed flowers. She smiled, brushing dirt from her hands. It's therapeutic. Besides, someone needs to take care of these. They were looking a little neglected. Zachary crouched beside her, picking up a fallen rose petal. You're not what I expected, Samantha. And what exactly did you expect? She asked, arching an eyebrow. He hesitated, as if choosing his words carefully. Someone different. I don't know. I guess I assumed you'd be more transactional about all of this. Her smile faded, replaced by a look of quiet understanding. I'm here for my family, Zachary. That's the only reason I agreed to this. But that doesn't mean I don't care about doing the right thing. Her words struck a chord with him, and for the first time, he felt a pang of regret for how he had treated her. That evening, Arthur summoned Zachary and Samantha to his office. The room was dimly lit, the heavy drapes drawn tight, adding to the oppressive atmosphere. Arthur sat behind his desk, his expression unreadable. I've noticed some changes in you, Zachary, he began, his tone carefully measured. You've been more involved lately, more proactive. Zachary crossed his arms, leaning against the back of a chair. You say that like it's a bad thing. Arthur's lips curled into a faint smile. Not bad, unexpected, but let's not forget who's in charge here. Samantha shifted uncomfortably, sensing the tension between father and son. Is there a point to this meeting, Dad? Zachary asked, his patience clearly wearing thin. Arthur's smile disappeared. Yes, the gala last week. Your speech, it was impressive, but it also raised questions. Questions, Zachary repeated, his tone skeptical. Arthur nodded. About your intentions? About whether you're trying to undermine me? Zachary straightened, his expression hardening. I'm not trying to undermine you. I'm trying to fix the mess you've been hiding. Samantha's breath caught, but she remained silent, her eyes darting between the two men. Arthur's gaze darkened. Be careful, Zachary. You're walking a fine line. So are you, Zachary shot back. After the tense meeting, Samantha found Zachary in the library, pacing back and forth with a drink in hand. Are you okay? She asked gently. He stopped, turning to her with a bitter laugh. Define okay. Samantha approached him cautiously. You stood up to him. That's more than most people would do. It doesn't feel like enough, he admitted, running a hand through his hair. No matter what I do, he always finds a way to make me feel like I'm still a kid, like I'm not capable of handling anything without his approval. You are capable. Zachary, Samantha said firmly. You've already proven that. He looked at her, his expression softening. You're the first person who's ever said that to me. Her heart ached at the vulnerability in his voice. Then maybe you need to start believing it. The next few days were filled with small but meaningful moments between them. Zachary began confiding in Samantha more, sharing stories from his childhood and his complicated relationship with Arthur. Samantha, in turn, opened up about her own struggles, her mother's illness, the weight of responsibility she had carried for years. One evening, as they sat on the balcony overlooking the city, Zachary turned to her with a thoughtful expression. "You're different from anyone I've ever known," he said quietly. She smiled faintly. "I could say the same about you." They sat in comfortable silence for a while, the city lights twinkling below. For the first time since their marriage, it felt like they were truly connecting, not as strangers forced into an arrangement, but as two people who were beginning to understand each other. Samantha began to notice changes in Zachary outside their private moments as well. At business meetings and social events, he carried himself with more confidence, speaking with conviction and challenging decisions he didn't agree with. Arthur, though visibly displeased, couldn't deny the results. Under Zachary's guidance, the company began to stabilize, and murmurs of doubt about the younger Sullivan's capabilities began to fade. Samantha felt a swell of pride every time she saw him take charge, knowing that she had played a small part in helping him find his voice. But as their bond grew stronger, so did the shadow of Arthur's influence. Samantha couldn't shake the feeling that the patriarch was waiting for the perfect moment to reassert his control. And when that moment came, it would test everything they had built together. The Sullivan mansion felt heavier than usual, the tension almost palpable. Arthur's displeasure with Zachary's growing independence was no longer subtle. He watched his son's every move, his sharp gaze a constant reminder that he wasn't ready to relinquish control. Samantha noticed the shift immediately. Arthur's once controlled demeanor had turned colder, his words sharper. It was as if he were waiting for Zachary to make a mistake, ready to pounce at the slightest misstep. At breakfast, Arthur spoke in his usual measured tone, but the undercurrent of his words was biting. "Zachary, I've scheduled a meeting with our investors this Friday. I trust you'll have something substantial to show for all your recent efforts." Zachary looked up from his coffee, meeting his father's gaze with a calm he had recently mastered. "Of course, I've been working on a proposal that will secure the funding we need and strengthen our partnerships." Arthur's smile didn't reach his eyes. "I'm looking forward to it," Samantha, sitting quietly beside Zachary, could sense the unspoken challenge between them. She reached for her glass of water, focusing on the conversation but staying silent. Later that day, as Zachary prepared for the investor meeting, Samantha found him in his office, surrounded by spreadsheets and reports. His sleeves were rolled up, and his usually perfectly combed hair was slightly disheveled. "You've been at this for hours," she said, leaning against the doorframe. He glanced up, his eyes tired but determined. "I have to get this right. My father's waiting for me to fail." "You're not going to fail," she said firmly, walking over to stand beside him. "You've done your homework, and you know what you're talking about. Trust yourself." Zachary sighed, leaning back in his chair. "It's not just about the investors. It's about proving to him, and to myself, that I can do this." Samantha placed a reassuring hand on his shoulder. "You've already proven it. Now it's just a matter of showing everyone else." Her words seemed to calm him, and he offered her a small, grateful smile. The day of the investor meeting arrived, and the Sullivan boardroom was filled with sharply dressed executives and potential stakeholders. Arthur sat at the head of the table, his presence commanding, while Zachary stood at the front, ready to present his proposal. Samantha, though not officially part of the meeting, had managed to observe from a corner of the room. She watched as Zachary spoke with confidence and clarity, outlining his vision for the company's future. The investors nodded in approval, and murmurs of agreement spread around the table. Even Arthur seemed impressed, though his expression remained stoic. When Zachary finished, there was a round of applause. One of the senior investors, Mr. Hawthorne, leaned forward with a smile. "Impressive work. Zachary, it's clear you have a strong grasp of what this company needs." Zachary thanked him, but his gaze flicked briefly to Arthur, searching for a reaction. Arthur offered a curt nod, his approval begrudging but unmistakable. That evening, the mansion was quiet, the aftermath of the successful meeting leaving a sense of calm for everyone except Arthur. Samantha found him in his office, staring out the window with a glass of whiskey in hand. "Mr. Sullivan," she said softly, stepping inside. Arthur didn't turn, but his voice was cold. "What do you want, Samantha?" She hesitated before speaking. "I wanted to thank you for giving Zachary the chance to lead. He's proven himself, and it's because of the opportunities you've given him." Arthur turned then, his gaze piercing. "Do you think I don't know what you're doing?" Samantha frowned. "I don't understand." "Don't play coy," he interrupted. "You've been feeding him confidence, pushing him to challenge me. But let me make one thing clear. You don't belong here. You never did." His words were like a slap. But Samantha stood her ground. "With all due respect, Mr. Sullivan, Zachary's success has nothing to do with me manipulating him. He's capable on his own. You just never gave him the chance to prove it." Arthur's eyes narrowed. "You're playing a dangerous game, Samantha." She lifted her chin. "I'm not playing any game. I'm just supporting my husband." Arthur's jaw tightened, but he said nothing more. Turning back to the window, Samantha left his office with her heart pounding. She had stood up to Arthur Sullivan, something most people wouldn't dare to do. But she also knew she had made an enemy of a man who didn't take challenges lightly. When she told Zachary about the conversation later that night, his expression darkened. "He said that to you?" Zachary asked, anger flickering in his eyes. Samantha nodded. "He doesn't trust me. Or you." Zachary sighed, running a hand through his hair. "He's trying to scare you, to keep you in line. Don't let him get to you." "I won't," she said firmly. "But you need to be careful, Zachary. He's not going to let go of control easily." "I know," Zachary said, his voice resolute. "But I'm done letting him dictate my life. If he wants a fight, I'll give him one." Samantha reached for his hand, squeezing it gently. "You're not alone in this." He looked at her, the weight of her support grounding him. "Thank you, Samantha, for everything." As they sat together in the quiet of the night, the bond between them grew stronger. But both knew that Arthur wasn't finished, and that the challenges ahead would test them more than ever. The days following Zachary's triumph in the investor meeting brought a newfound energy to the Sullivan mansion. Zachary's growing confidence and proactive leadership were impossible to ignore, and even the staff seemed to sense the shift in dynamics. But the tension between father and son simmered just beneath the surface, threatening to boil over at any moment. Samantha found herself standing at Zachary's side more often than not. Their partnership, once forced and awkward, now felt natural, even comfortable. She had become his sounding board, offering insights and encouragement as he navigated the complexities of the family business. One afternoon, as they reviewed plans for an upcoming charity event, Zachary glanced at her and smiled. "You've been a lifesaver. You know that." Samantha arched an eyebrow. "Lifesaver, that's a bit dramatic," he chuckled. "I'm serious. I don't think I could have done all this without you." Her expression softened. "You don't give yourself enough credit, Zachary. You've done the hard work. I've just been here to remind you of what you're capable of." That evening, the mansion was abuzz with preparations for the charity gala. Samantha had spent the afternoon coordinating with staff, ensuring every detail was perfect. The event was critical, not just for the company's image, but also for Zachary's growing reputation as a leader. Arthur, however, had other plans. As Samantha adjusted the centerpieces in the ballroom, Arthur approached her, his presence as imposing as ever. "You're quite the busy bee, aren't you?" he said, his tone laced with condescension. Samantha turned to face him, her expression calm. "Just making sure everything is ready for tonight." Arthur stepped closer, his gaze cold. "You've certainly made yourself indispensable, haven't you? But don't think for a second that this changes anything. You're still here because of me." Samantha held her ground. "With all due respect, Mr. Sullivan, I'm here because Zachary believes in me, and whether you like it or not, I'm going to support him." Arthur's eyes narrowed, but before he could respond, Zachary entered the room, his expression sharp. "Is there a problem here?" Zachary asked, his tone even but firm. Arthur turned to his son, his smile tight. "No problem at all. Just a friendly conversation." Samantha glanced at Zachary, her eyes silently conveying the truth. Arthur's gaze lingered on them for a moment before he stepped back. "I'll see you both at the gala," he said, his voice dripping with warning. As soon as Arthur left, Zachary turned to Samantha. "What did he say to you?" She hesitated. "Nothing I couldn't handle." Zachary frowned. "Samantha, if he's crossing a line—" "I'm fine," she interrupted gently. "He's trying to intimidate me. But it won't work. He doesn't scare me." A flicker of admiration crossed Zachary's face. "You're braver than most people I know." She smiled. "I just know what I'm fighting for." The charity gala that evening was a dazzling affair. The ballroom glittered with chandeliers and the air buzzed with conversation and laughter. Zachary and Samantha entered together, their presence commanding attention. Samantha wore a floor-length emerald gown that accentuated her natural grace, and Zachary, in a tailored black tuxedo, exuded confidence. To the outside world, they looked every bit the perfect power couple as they mingled with guests. Zachary noticed how effortlessly Samantha navigated the room. She charmed everyone she spoke to, her warmth and authenticity setting her apart from the usual polished but impersonal crowd. "Your wife is remarkable," one guest remarked to Zachary, watching as Samantha laughed with a group of attendees. "She is," Zachary replied, the realization catching him off guard. During the gala, Arthur took the stage to deliver a speech. He spoke about the company's legacy, the importance of tradition, and the value of giving back. His words were polished, but Samantha could sense the underlying message, a reminder of his control over everything. When it was Zachary's turn to speak, he approached the podium with quiet confidence. His speech was heartfelt and genuine, focusing on the future and the need for innovation and integrity in the company's dealings. The audience responded with enthusiastic applause, and Samantha felt a swell of pride. As Zachary stepped down from the stage, he made his way to Samantha, his expression softer than she had ever seen. "How did I do?" he asked, his voice low enough that only she could hear. "You were incredible," she said, her smile radiant. For a moment, the noise and bustle of the gala faded into the background, and they stood there, a silent understanding passing between them. As the night wore on, Samantha caught snippets of conversations among the guests. Many praised Zachary's speech, commenting on how he was finally stepping out of his father's shadow, but she also overheard murmurs of doubt, whispers about Arthur's reluctance to let go of power. When the gala ended and the guests began to leave, Arthur approached Zachary and Samantha, his expression unreadable. "You did well tonight," Arthur said, his tone devoid of warmth. "Thank you," Zachary replied, his voice steady. Arthur's gaze shifted to Samantha. "You've certainly made your mark. Haven't you?" Samantha met his stare without flinching. "I'm just doing my part." Arthur smirked, though there was no humor in it. "Enjoy the spotlight while it lasts." With that, he turned and walked away, leaving them in the quiet of the now empty ballroom. Zachary exhaled, running a hand through his hair. "He's not going to stop, is he?" "No," Samantha said softly. "But neither are we." Zachary looked at her, his resolve hardening. "Then we'll face him together." The days after the charity gala brought a surprising sense of calm to the Sullivan mansion. Zachary had managed to solidify his reputation among the investors, and whispers of his potential to lead the company had begun to spread. For the first time in a long while, he felt like he was finally stepping out of Arthur's shadow. Samantha, too, noticed the change in him. He was more confident, more assured in his decisions and less defensive in their conversations. The sharp edges of his personality had softened, and in their place, she saw glimpses of the man beneath the armor. One crisp afternoon, Samantha decided to spend time in the garden, a place that had become her refuge. She knelt by the rose bushes, carefully pruning away the dead leaves. "You and those roses again?" Zachary's voice broke the quiet. She looked up, smiling as he approached. "They need care, just like anything else." He crouched beside her, inspecting one of the blooms. "You've done a good job with them. They look healthier than they did a few weeks ago." "Thank you," she said, surprised by the genuine compliment for a moment. They worked side by side in comfortable silence. The sun cast a warm glow over the garden, and the scent of flowers filled the air. "So," Zachary said, breaking the quiet, "what would you be doing right now if you weren't here?" Samantha paused, considering the question. "Probably working another job. Trying to keep up with bills and my mom's treatments." His expression softened. "You've sacrificed a lot for your family." She shrugged. "It's what you do for the people you love." Her words hung in the air, and Zachary found himself studying her face, the sincerity in her eyes. "You're an incredible person." "Samantha, I don't think I've ever told you that." She looked at him startled. "What brought that on?" He chuckled, running a hand through his hair. "Just realizing how much I've underestimated you." Her heart fluttered at his words, but she pushed the feeling aside. "You're not so bad yourself." Zachary Sullivan. They shared a smile, a warmth passing between them that neither could deny. That evening, Samantha found herself thinking about Zachary more than she cared to admit. His words, his actions, the way he had started to open up to her. It was all so unexpected. She had agreed to this arrangement out of necessity, never imagining that it might lead to something real. As she sat in her room, her thoughts were interrupted by a knock at the door. When she opened it, Zachary stood there, his expression uncharacteristically nervous. "Is everything okay?" she asked. He nodded, then hesitated. "I was wondering if you'd like to join me for dinner." "Just us." Samantha blinked, surprised by the invitation. "You mean, like a date?" His lips twitched into a small smile. "Something like that." She hesitated, then nodded. "Sure, I'd like that." The private dinner was held on the mansion's terrace, with candles flickering softly in the evening breeze. The staff had prepared a simple but elegant meal, and the view of the city lights below added a touch of magic to the atmosphere. "This is unexpected," Samantha said as they sat down. Zachary smiled, pouring her a glass of wine. "I figured it was time we spent some time together without anyone watching or judging." They talked over dinner, their conversation flowing more easily than ever before. Zachary shared stories from his childhood, moments when he had tried, and often failed, to live up to Arthur's expectations. Samantha, in turn, opened up about her struggles, the challenges of growing up in a working-class family, and the sacrifices she had made for her mother. "I don't think I've ever told anyone this much about myself," Zachary admitted as they finished dessert. "Maybe you just needed the right person to listen," Samantha said softly. He looked at her, his gaze lingering. "I think you're right." After dinner, they lingered on the terrace, the city lights twinkling in the distance. Zachary leaned against the railing, his hands in his pockets. "I never thought I'd say this, but I'm glad you're here, Samantha," he said, his voice quiet. She stepped closer, her heart pounding. "I'm glad I'm here too." For a moment, they stood in silence, the distance between them narrowing. Zachary reached for her hand, his touch gentle. "Samantha," he began, his voice filled with an emotion she hadn't heard before. "This started as something neither of us wanted, but now..." He trailed off, his eyes searching hers. She felt her breath catch. "Now what?" "Now I'm not sure I want it to end," he admitted, his words barely above a whisper. Her heart raced, and before she could stop herself, she said, "I don't want it to end either." The space between them disappeared as Zachary leaned in, capturing her lips in a kiss that was soft and tentative at first, then deepened with a passion that took them both by surprise. When they finally pulled away, Samantha looked up at him, her cheeks flushed. "What does this mean?" "It means," Zachary said, his voice steady, "that this is no longer just an arrangement for me. I don't know what the future holds, but I want to figure it out. With you." Tears welled in her eyes, but she smiled. "Me too." That night, as Samantha lay in bed, she couldn't help but think about how far they had come. What had started as a forced partnership was slowly becoming something genuine, something worth fighting for. But deep down, she knew that their newfound happiness would face challenges, and that Arthur Sullivan wouldn't let go of his control without a fight. The warmth of their shared moment lingered between Zachary and Samantha in the days that followed. There was a new energy in the Sullivan mansion, a quiet sense of something shifting. For the first time, Samantha felt like she truly belonged, not as a pawn in Arthur's game, but as an equal partner to Zachary. But the weight of Arthur's looming presence was a constant reminder that their happiness was fragile. Samantha knew he wouldn't stand by idly, as Zachary continued to assert his independence. One morning, as Samantha prepared for the day, she found a sealed envelope slipped under her door. Inside was a note in Arthur's crisp handwriting. "Meet me in my office at once. Arthur Sullivan." She sighed, bracing herself for whatever was to come. When she entered Arthur's office, he was seated behind his imposing desk, his fingers steepled as he studied her. "Mrs. Sullivan," he began, his tone icy. "Take a seat." She did as he asked, keeping her expression neutral. "I've been watching you," Arthur said, his gaze piercing. "You've ingratiated yourself well into this family. Too well, in fact." Samantha's heart pounded, but she kept her voice steady. I'm just trying to support Zachary. Arthur leaned forward, his eyes narrowing. Support him or manipulate him? Her stomach twisted at the accusation. I would never manipulate him. Arthur's smile was humorless. Don't play innocent with me, Samantha. You've emboldened him, turned him against me, and while you might think you're helping him, you're only making things harder for yourself. I'm not turning him against you, she replied firmly. He's finding his own voice, and you don't like it. Arthur's jaw tightened. Let me make this clear. You're an outsider, Samantha. You don't belong here, and you never will. If you care about Zachary as much as you claim, you'll leave before you destroy everything he's worked for. Samantha's breath caught, but she refused to let Arthur see her falter. If you think threatening me will make me walk away, you're wrong. I'm not going anywhere. Arthur's lips curled into a sneer. We'll see about that. Samantha left the office shaken, but resolute. Arthur's words had struck a nerve, but they also fueled her determination. She found Zachary in the library, engrossed in a stack of documents. Zachary, she said, her voice steady but urgent. He looked up, immediately sensing her distress. What's wrong? It's your father, she said, sitting down beside him. He wants me to leave. He thinks I'm a threat to you. Zachary's expression darkened. What did he say to you? She hesitated, then recounted the conversation in Arthur's office. By the time she finished, Zachary's jaw was clenched, his fists tight at his sides. He has no right to talk to you like that, he said, his voice low and angry. He's just trying to protect his control, Samantha said. But Zachary, we need to decide how we're going to handle this. He's not going to back down. Zachary took a deep breath, his anger giving way to determination. We handle it together. He doesn't get to dictate our lives anymore. That evening, as they sat on the balcony overlooking the city, Samantha turned to Zachary. What are you going to do? She asked softly. He stared out at the skyline, his expression thoughtful. For years, I've let him control everything. My choices, my future, but I'm done living under his thumb. It's time I take a stand, for myself and for us. Her heart swelled at his words. I'll be with you every step of the way. He looked at her, his gaze unwavering. I know you will, and that's why I'm not afraid anymore. The next morning, Zachary called a meeting with Arthur in the study. Samantha insisted on being there, standing beside him as a silent show of support. Arthur entered the room, his expression guarded. What's this about? Zachary stepped forward, his tone firm. It's about the future of this family and this company. Things are going to change, Dad, whether you like it or not. Arthur raised an eyebrow. And what exactly do you mean by that? I mean, I'm done playing by your rules, Zachary said. I'm taking control of my life and my role in this family. You've had your time, and now it's mine. Arthur's jaw tightened. And you think you're ready for that? You have no idea what it takes to run this empire. I know more than you give me credit for, Zachary shot back. And I've proven that I can handle it. The investors trust me. The board trusts me. And it's time you do too. Arthur's gaze flicked to Samantha, his expression hardening. This is her influence, isn't it? No, Zachary said firmly. This is me finally standing up for myself. Samantha has been my support, but these decisions are mine. Arthur studied his son for a long moment, the weight of the confrontation hanging heavily in the air. Finally, he exhaled, his shoulders sagging slightly. If this is what you want, Zachary, then so be it, he said, though his tone was far from conceding. But don't expect me to clean up your messes. Zachary nodded, his resolve unwavering. I won't. As Arthur left the room, the tension slowly ebbed away. Samantha turned to Zachary, a mix of relief and pride in her expression. You did it, she said softly. He smiled, pulling her into a hug. We did it. For the first time in years, Zachary felt free from his father's control, free to make his own choices, and free to build a future with Samantha by his side. The days following Zachary's confrontation with Arthur felt like a calm before the storm. While Zachary had taken a firm stand, Samantha knew Arthur wasn't one to let go of control without a fight. The tension in the mansion was thick, and every conversation with Arthur felt like navigating a minefield. Samantha had become Zachary's closest confidant, and their bond had only grown stronger. She admired his resilience, but she couldn't shake the feeling that Arthur was planning something to regain his upper hand. One morning, Samantha was in the kitchen helping the staff prepare breakfast when one of the maids approached her hesitantly. "Mrs. Sullivan," the maid said in a low voice, glancing around nervously. "I overheard something last night. Mr. Arthur was speaking with one of the board members on the phone." Samantha's brow furrowed. "What did he say?" The maid hesitated. "He mentioned looking into ways to dissolve Zachary's authority. Something about leveraging old contracts and loopholes." Samantha's stomach sank. She had anticipated resistance, but this was a direct threat to everything Zachary had worked for. "Thank you for telling me," she said. Her voice steadied despite the unease creeping through her. The maid nodded and hurried off, leaving Samantha to process the information. That evening, Samantha found Zachary in the library, reviewing documents for an upcoming board meeting. She closed the door behind her, her expression serious. "We need to talk," she said. Sitting across from him, Zachary looked up, concern flickering in his eyes. "What's wrong?" "I heard something today," she began, her voice calm but firm. "Your father is planning to undermine you at the next board meeting. He's looking for ways to revoke your authority." Zachary leaned back in his chair, his jaw tightening. "Of course he is. He can't stand the idea of losing control. We can't let him win," Samantha said, her determination clear. "You've worked too hard for this." He nodded, his mind already racing. "If he's looking for loopholes, then we need to be prepared. I'll go through the contracts and find anything he might use against me." "I'll help," Samantha said without hesitation. Zachary reached across the table, taking her hand. "Thank you, Samantha. I don't know what I'd do without you." She squeezed his hand, her resolve strengthening. "We're in this together." The days leading up to the board meeting were a blur of late nights and strategy sessions. Samantha and Zachary combed through mountains of documents, searching for potential vulnerabilities. Arthur, meanwhile, remained tight-lipped, his demeanor giving nothing away. But Samantha could see the subtle signs of his strategy: whispered phone calls, closed-door meetings, and the way he watched Zachary with calculating eyes. On the night before the meeting, Zachary and Samantha sat in the study, surrounded by files and notes. "Do you think we're ready?" Samantha asked, glancing at him. "We have to be," Zachary replied, though there was a flicker of doubt in his voice. Samantha placed a hand on his shoulder, her gaze steady. "You've got this, Zachary. You've proven yourself time and time again. Tomorrow is just another step." Her words seemed to reassure him, and he gave her a small smile. "You always know what to say." The morning of the board meeting arrived, and the atmosphere in the mansion was tense. Zachary dressed in a sharp navy suit, his expression a mask of calm determination. Samantha adjusted his tie, her touch steady and reassuring. "You look ready to take on the world," she said with a smile. "Thanks to you," he replied, his voice soft. They made their way to the boardroom, where the members were already gathered. Arthur sat at the head of the table, his expression unreadable. The meeting began with routine updates, but it didn't take long for Arthur to make his move. "I'd like to address a matter of concern," Arthur said, his tone measured. "It has come to my attention that certain decisions have been made without proper oversight. I believe it's time we reconsider the delegation of authority within this company." Zachary's jaw tightened, but he remained composed. "With all due respect, the board has approved every decision I've made. I've been transparent and thorough in my leadership." Arthur's smile was cold. "Transparency is subjective, Zachary, and while I commend your efforts, it's clear that more experienced leadership is needed during these challenging times." The room fell silent, the tension thick. Zachary stood, his voice steady. "With all due respect, Father, this company doesn't need more of the same. It needs innovation, integrity, and a commitment to the future. That's what I've been working toward, and the results speak for themselves." He turned to the board members, his gaze sweeping across the room. "I understand that change is difficult, but it's necessary. I'm not asking for blind trust. I'm asking for the chance to prove that this company can thrive under my leadership." There was a murmur of agreement among the board members, and Samantha felt a surge of pride as she watched Zachary hold his ground. Arthur, sensing the tide turning against him, leaned back in his chair. "Very well, Zachary. The board will decide." After the meeting, Zachary and Samantha walked out of the boardroom together, their steps in sync. "You were incredible," Samantha said, her voice filled with admiration. He smiled, the weight of the confrontation slowly lifting. "I couldn't have done it without you." Samantha stopped, turning to face him. "Yes, you could have. You've always had it in you, Zachary. You just needed to believe it." He reached for her hand, his eyes filled with gratitude. "I believe it now, and I believe in us." Samantha smiled, her heart full. "So do I." As they walked back to the mansion, hand in hand, they knew the fight wasn't over. But together, they were stronger than ever. The mansion was unusually quiet the morning after the board meeting. The tension that had hung over the Sullivan family for weeks seemed to dissolve. Replaced by a fragile sense of calm, Zachary had stood his ground, and while the board hadn't officially announced their decision, the shift in their support was evident. Arthur, however, remained a looming presence. His retreat to his office after the meeting was as much a calculated move as it was a warning. Samantha and Zachary both knew he wasn't finished. Later that day, Samantha found herself in the garden, tending to the roses that had become her refuge. She knelt beside the vibrant blooms, her hands brushing away dead leaves as she reflected on how much had changed. "You're always out here," came Zachary's voice from behind her. She turned, smiling as he approached. "It's peaceful. Helps me think." He crouched beside her, his gaze soft. "I wanted to thank you for everything. I don't think I would have made it this far without you." She placed a hand on his. "You've always had it in you, Zachary. You just needed someone to remind you." He looked at her, his expression serious. "I mean it, Samantha. You've changed my life in ways I never thought possible. What started as a nightmare has turned into something I wouldn't trade for anything." Her breath caught at his words, but before she could respond, a voice interrupted them. "Well, isn't this touching?" Arthur said. Stepping into the garden, Samantha and Zachary stood, their moment interrupted by the man who had orchestrated the beginning of their story. "Dad," Zachary said, his tone measured. Arthur's gaze swept over them, his expression unreadable. "I came to speak with you, Zachary, alone." Samantha hesitated, but Zachary nodded. "It's okay," he said softly, giving her hand a reassuring squeeze. She reluctantly left, casting a final glance at Zachary before disappearing into the mansion. Arthur and Zachary stood in silence for a moment, the air heavy with unspoken words. "You've surprised me, Zachary," Arthur said finally, his tone almost begrudging. "Have I?" Zachary replied, crossing his arms. Arthur nodded. "You've shown strength I didn't think you had. I underestimated you." Zachary raised an eyebrow. "Is that your way of admitting you were wrong?" Arthur smirked, though there was little humor in it. "Don't push your luck." There was a pause before Arthur spoke again, his tone softening. "This company means everything to me. It's my legacy, my life's work. I built it to secure a future for this family, and I want to honor that legacy," Zachary said. "But it has to evolve, Dad. It has to stand for something more than just power and control." Arthur studied his son. A flicker of something, pride perhaps, crossing his face. "You're determined to see this through, aren't you?" "Yes," Zachary said firmly. Arthur sighed, his shoulders sagging slightly. "Then I suppose it's time I step aside." Zachary blinked, stunned. "You mean that?" Arthur nodded. "I've fought you every step of the way, but maybe it's time I let you take the reins. You've earned it." When Zachary returned to the mansion, he found Samantha in the library, her face lighting up when she saw him. "What happened?" she asked, standing to meet him. "He's stepping down," Zachary said, still processing the words himself. "He's letting me take over." Samantha's eyes widened. "Zachary, that's incredible." He smiled, pulling her into a hug. "I couldn't have done it without you, Samantha. You've been my anchor through all of this." She pulled back slightly, looking up at him. "And you've shown everyone, including your father, the kind of leader you can be." In the weeks that followed, Zachary officially took over as CEO of the Sullivan family business. His leadership brought a fresh perspective, focusing on innovation and integrity, values that resonated with both the board and the company's employees. Arthur, true to his word, stepped back, though his presence in the mansion remained a constant reminder of the challenges Zachary had overcome. Samantha, meanwhile, found herself more deeply involved in the business than she had ever expected. Her insights and unwavering support made her an invaluable partner, not just to Zachary, but to the company as a whole. One evening, as they sat on the balcony overlooking the city, Zachary turned to Samantha, his expression thoughtful. "You know, this all started as a mess," he said. "A forced marriage, a family in crisis, a father who couldn't let go. And now," Samantha asked, smiling, "and now, it feels like the beginning of something real," he said. "Something we built together." She leaned against his shoulder, her heart full. "I never imagined this is where we'd end up, but I wouldn't change a thing." "Neither would I," Zachary said, pressing a kiss to her forehead, as they sat together under the stars. The weight of the past fell away, leaving only the promise of a future they would shape together.